In the next set of questions, we're going to focus on specific casino games and particular gambling activities. Now, you've done a lot of research surrounding the psychology of different casino games, and one of your first projects involves studying slot games. Can you please summarise your key findings for us?
Well, I've never stopped researching slot machines. I mean, I've published papers on slot machines almost every year. Okay, my perspective comes from the factors. When I first started, I was looking at to what extent slot machines were being played by children, to what effect slot machines had on children. Most of my early studies showed that slot machines were the only commercial activity that children can gamble on, that a small proportion did seem to have addictive-like patterns that you would find in either more traditional addictions or other types of gambling addictions that you find in adults. I've never stopped researching in slot machines. I mean, now, my research, I look at the individual factors, I look at the situational factors, the structural factors. What interests me most now is I think most people realise that there are always individual risk factors within a person themselves that make them more vulnerable to develop addictions of one sort or another. I mean, people talk about things like addictive personality, which I don't believe at all, because I don't think there is a set of personality traits that predicts addiction and addiction alone. However, there are certainly predisposing factors. So we know there are genetic and biological factors. Okay, so whether it's a slot machine player or whether it's a horse race gambler, is that, for instance, if you have a particular set of genetic markers, there's a gene called the DRD2 gene, nothing to do with Star Wars, but it's one of these genes that is implicated in lots of different impulsive behaviours. So, for instance, there was a really classic study that was done back in the 1990s that showed that basically 50% of pathological gamblers had this particular genetic variant, and that 25% of non-pathological gamblers had this particular genetic variant. Now, there are two implications from that. One is that even if you haven't got the gene, you might still become a problem gambler, because 50% of problem gamblers didn't have this genetic variation. Also shows that even if you've got this genetic variant, it doesn't mean that you're automatically going to become a problem gambler. There are lots of other factors as well. And of course, I'm very much interested in what are the other psychological, structural and situational factors that develop. Now, when it comes to slot machines, you hear this phrase that slot machines, fixed odds betting terminals, video lottery terminals, pokie machines in Australia, people use this phrase that they're the crack cocaine of gambling. And what they mean by that is that there's a high association between slot machines and problem gambling. Now, I wrote a paper earlier this year, and I wrote that basically the type of game is irrelevant in terms of developing addiction, and people thought, that, how can you say that, Mark? There's all this evidence that is quite clearly it's to do with game. And I said, no, it's not to do with the game, it's to do with the structural characteristics. Okay, so what my research on slot machine has shown is that the single most important factor in terms of whether people develop a problem or not, if you are that vulnerable or susceptible person, if you've got that biological or genetic predisposition, if you have a particular set of psychological characteristics, the biggest single factor that will dictate whether you become addicted to a particular game is event frequency of the activity. And what I mean by that is that a typical slot machine in a pub, you can gamble 12 times a minute on a typical pub slot machine. To take the national lottery, you can only gamble, or at least find out the result if you gamble, twice a week on a national lottery. Okay? I've never met anybody addicted to the national lottery. You can't become addicted to something that you're only rewarded for twice a week. You can buy lots of tickets, buy lots of, but you can only find out the result of your gamble twice a week. So you can only be, unless you're some bizarre person that gets a buzz from actually buying the lottery ticket in and of itself, is you can't become addicted to a discontinuous gambling activity. That's why I've never come across anybody addicted to football pools, I've never come across anybody addicted to a bi-weekly national lottery. But what you tend to find is that activities like horse race gambling or sports betting, where you can gamble again and again and again and again, they are the activities that tend to be problematic. Now, the thing is, people have looked at the research and said, we find, what you find in all the research studies is that slot machines have a high association with problem gambling. And people say, well, it must be the game then. But the thing is, I could design you the safest slot machine in the world, and I guarantee no one will ever become addicted to it. And the only thing I would do is just change the structural characteristics and make sure that people can only press the button twice a week. No one will ever become addicted to a slot machine. Now you say I might be being facetious, but things, I could design you the most addictive lottery game. Okay, we can take the lottery game as it is now, the bi-weekly game, and instead of having the draw every twice a week, we'll have the draw every 2 minutes. Okay, now there are games like that, it's called Keno in the US. okay, they have a fast action lottery draw where the draws are every 2 minutes. They're often played in post offices, supermarkets, and I can tell you now, people that play those types of games do develop problems if you're vulnerable or susceptible. So it's not the game, it's not to demonise fixed odds betting terminals or to demonise slot machines. It's about the structural characteristics of how you design. If you design basically a high event frequency game, and that can be a lottery and that can be a slot machine, if you're vulnerable or susceptible, there's a high risk you will develop a problem with that particular product.
I suppose the popular high variance online slot machines where you can put on auto spin and
exactly the event frequency there can be 30 or 40 times a minute. Now I remember, this is the true story actually, in 1996 my work was used in the Dutch Parliament to decide whether slot machines, the spin of the reel should be 3.5 or 3.6 seconds. Because basically at the time, obviously Holland had guilders then rather than euros, but of course the machine industry wanted it to be 3.5 seconds, okay, because obviously that tenth of a second, okay, is that in terms of the money they can make, the faster you make the reel spins, the more money you make in the end, because all those tenths of a second add up when you times it by the thousands and thousands of slot machines times the number of players playing them every single day across the year. Now that's just a tenth of a second. But like you say, online, I've seen online slot machines. You can gamble 30 or 40 times on a slot machine. Now, if you tie up event frequency with high accessibility, so a thing we also know about is that problem gambling is very much related to the opportunities to gamble within a particular area. So if you've got a high event frequency activity with a highly accessible product, those two factors alone, if you're vulnerable or susceptible, will have a major impact in terms of developing a problem. That's, we know that, again, I just gave you the example before, the highest prevalence of problem gambling in the world is in Las Vegas, because it's the most saturated environment that's got gambling products. But of course now, we all have Las Vegas in our front room in terms of the tablets, mobiles, internet that we gamble on. We've got 3,000 online gambling sites that we can go to at the push of a button. So effectively, we now do have high accessibility. Now if you add in another structural characteristic, jackpot size, we know that huge jackpots, okay, get people to gamble in the first place. That's a structural characteristic that is usually associated with acquisition, getting people to gamble. We know on rollover weeks on the lottery, far more people gamble when there's a rollover week. So if I wanted to design you the most addictive activity, I'd design you a slot machine that has a chance of winning £1 million per spin in a highly accessible area. And of course, where do you find those things? You find them in Las Vegas, Atlantic City. We're talking about the situation and structural factors coming together. Then you start to throw in lots of other things. I mean, we recently did a review and we found over 70 different structural characteristics within a slot machine. So another really important one is something that we call psychology of the near miss. Okay, so in all slot machines, most scratch cards, in fact most games have what we call near miss experiences. So typically on a slot machine, the reels are lined up, the reels are there, and if you match 3, say, fruit symbols in a line, win a prize. But if reel spins lemon, reel spins lemon, reel spins lemon, just above or just below the pay line, that's a near miss. The thing we found in my research, for instance, in my early research, I used to measure people's heart rates while they were actually gambling. I used to get them to think aloud while they were gambling. Okay, what came through very clearly from that is that people get aroused, not only when they won, but also when they experience these near misses. What I also found is that gamblers, the more problematic you become, is that gamblers themselves start to create near misses themselves. So if I put a match, if I put a bet on tomorrow that England are going to beat Germany, and it ends up being 1-0 and it's a penalty that was given to German, as a hardcore gambler I might say so, I would have won my money if that referee hadn't given that stupid decision in the 67th minute to award a penalty. I turn what was clearly a losing experience, I validate it and turn it into a one where I would have won if nothing happened. So the question I'm always asked by people, why do gamblers consistently gamble if they're constantly losing? Gamblers don't constantly lose. Gamblers constantly nearly win. And that nearly winning is physiologically reinforcing and it's psychologically reinforcing as well. So that's why slot machines are the perfect example of giving lots and lots of near-miss experiences. They're pre-programmed to do that. Scratch cards, in terms of the way they're designed. Anytime you scratch off a scratch card, you might scratch off the third soon, 25 quid, 25 quid. You've got another 4 things to scratch off. Hope that 25 will come up. Doesn't come up. But you still felt aroused that you nearly won on that. So that's a classic. So when you've got you know, high event frequency, and you couple it with near miss, and then you add in, you know, the sounds of the sounds of the coins dropping in to the tray. That acoustic, you know, whether it's music playing, whatever, all these things have an impact in terms of changing your psychology. So, for instance, I did a lot of research in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s on the Simpsons slot machines. I mean, here is this, you know, what happened. I mean, when I first started researching slot machines, if you looked at the names of slot machines back in 1986, 1987, they were called things like Cash Point, Cash Line, Action Bank, Piggy Bank, Money Belt. These are all names that suggested this is where you can get money from, not where you can lose it. You know, there were names where they're what I would call acoustically attractive names: Nifty 50, Naughty But Nice, Real Fun, spelt R-E-E-L. Basically, all the machines were obviously, I don't think naming has any impact on addiction, but it's an acquisitional factor that might get you to play. But of course, what we saw over the 2000s is that most slot machines started going over to basically use the psychology of familiarity. So you associate your slot machine with a popular TV program, or a popular film, popular game like Trivial Pursuits or Monopoly, a popular video game like Sonic the Hedgehog or whatever. All the machines were linked, and what they're basically saying is that, you know something about me already before you've even played. You know, you've played Sonic, or you've played Monopoly, or you've watched Coronation Street or EastEnders. You know, you walk into a pub and you hear the you hear the Simpsons theme tune. You immediately know what that is. Here's the Simpsons. It appeals right across gender, age. I mean, they're just universally popular. There was at least 5 different Simpsons slot machines. You know, you put your money in a Simpsons slot machine, and Krusty the Clown says, "I knew you'd come crawling back." Bit of humour. You know, you just at a point where you've gambled your money and you lose. Homer shouts out, "Don't!" Just at the point you lose, makes, you know, reduces the guilt about the fact you've just lost. Loads of machines use verbal interaction cues, use humour as a way of minimising the fact that you're losing. I mean, it's just brilliant psychology that's used in the design of machines. Now, for me, it all comes back to the single most important factor is event frequency. It's how often you can gamble on that product. You know, if you can't gamble on that product regularly, you can't develop a problem. So, and again, it's a really important point. It's not that slot machines or fixed odds betting terminals are more addictive. It's that they are games that are designed with high event frequencies, and that's associated with problem gambling.
In your research, you've drawn parallels between slot game and video game addiction. I wondered if you could maybe elaborate on that connection.
Yeah, well, what became very clear when I started my PhD was when I was going into amusement arcades, and a lot of my original research was just pure observational research. What I started to notice, there wasn't a great deal of difference between the typical adolescent slot machine player and the typical adolescent video game player. The only real difference is that obviously video games tend to be far more skillful than slot machines. And I described in a 1991 paper, I got lambasted at the time for this, but I described video games as a non-financial form of gambling, which seems a paradox given that the whole basis of gambling is it's based on being able to win more money. But I argued that behaviourally, these two activities were almost identical. The only difference is that money was you gambled slot machines to win money, but you played video games to gain points. Now, in terms of things like the near miss, I mean, near miss is used all the time in video games. Designers put near miss, near win elements, and the thing is, when you've just failed to do something, the only way you can get rid of that frustration, what we call cognitive regret, is to play straight again. And that's what happens with slot machines as well. When we've just lost, basically it's just pressing the button. That's what happens on video games as well. But in terms of what we call operant conditioning, the idea of having small, unpredictable rewards keeps people persisting for longer. We find that in video games, and we find it in slot machines. What I basically did, I wrote paper after paper showing that in terms of event frequency, in terms of the psychology of the near miss, in terms of colours, in terms of sound. Like, for instance, I remember doing an experiment where I got people to play Tetris with and without music and measured their heart rates, and I found that even though people found the Tetris theme annoying, is that they were far more aroused when the music was on playing it than when it was off. Now, things like that, the influence of sound, the influence of colour, the event frequency, operant conditioning. What I was saying is that all these things, the only real difference between video games and slot machines were the skill level and the fact one was played for points and one was played for money. And in fact, every hardcore slot machine player, remember, on a typical slot machine, if you go into a pub, the most you can win is maybe 70 quid. I mean, it's just infinitesimally small compared to most other gambling activities where you can win a lot more. Most hardcore slot machine players do not play to win money. They play with money rather than for it, and their whole philosophy is to stay on the machine as long as possible using the least amount of money. And that's identical to what video game players do. They put their, when I was playing Space Invaders and Galactic, I put my 10 pence and I would see how long I can make that 10 pence last. Slot machine players do the same thing. They walk into an arcade with £10. A good day is when they make that £10 last 5 hours. A bad day is when that £10 goes in 10 minutes. Okay, now that's, you know, the thing about slot machine players and video game players, in slot machine, the money is a way of keeping score. It's exactly, you know, so when I talked about this idea of video game playing being a non-financial form of gambling, obviously I came from a world where I'd spent 4 years researching gambling and then realised there were commonalities in the psychology of video game playing. I didn't come from the other way. Now, of course, gambling and gaming is starting to converge. You know, all the kind of psychological techniques that are used in terms of repetitive play in video games are used in slot machines.
Vice versa, Skinner's box.
Yeah, exactly. It's Skinner box is operant conditioning. That's exactly what it is. You know, if I want, you know, the thing is, even with near misses, like near misses, they have to be at a certain level. So some of my colleagues in Canada, they found out the optimum kind of percentage for near misses to work is between about 37 to 42%. Thing is, if you give near misses all the time, it's a bit like cry wolf. You know that, you know, I never win, but what they do, there's like an optimum level, and round about a third, just over a third of times you get a near miss is enough to keep you playing again and again. Now, video games work on the same principle. They give you lots of near winning experiences. And as I say, the psychological feelings in terms of what people feel while they're playing slot machines or video games seem to be very similar. The body's physiology in terms of arousal while you're playing, or escape and relaxing, de-stressing, these are all commonalities that you find. So that's why, you know, I kind of I do as much on video game addiction as I do on slots now. And I think in terms of what's happening with youngsters is that they're probably now playing more games than gambling type games. You know, whereas 10 years ago, you know, you would have got a small proportion playing slots and buying scratch cards, etc. We've got less happening now, and they're probably playing more social games or more video games, because that's what they can do at home.
Okay, moving away from slots now. Blackjack and roulette remain the most popular casino games. How do you account for their popularity from a psychological perspective? What gratifications do they offer gamblers?
Okay, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that, you know, people talk about the psychology of gambling, and really there isn't a psychology of gambling, because the psychology of playing a slot machine is totally different from the psychology of playing poker, which is totally different from the psychology of horse racing, which is totally different from the psychology of playing roulette. Roulette, obviously, I play roulette, okay, and I never play roulette to win money. For me, it's about maximising the amount that I'm prepared to lose. You know, so typically, I mean, in the casino here, I go to my Gala casino, they still have 50p chips. And typically what I do, I'll put £5 worth of 50p chips all over the board. I've probably got 2/3 of the numbers covered. Okay. Now that strategy means that, you know, I can make basically with just £20, I can usually make that last 2 or 3 hours. Okay, that's what I do. I'm trying to maximise play. Occasionally I've done that strategy and I've lost everything in 15 minutes. When I've lost, and I stop playing. Now, the psychology of playing poker, obviously, poker, blackjack, these are games that if you're good and know what you're doing, you do actually have a good chance of winning. You know, we wouldn't have, you know, the same people winning the World Poker Championships again and again and again if it wasn't a game of skill. Now, there are chance elements in terms of the cards that you're dealt, and that's what you do. The psychology is playing with the hand that you've been dealt. But blackjack, you know, what I find amazing about that, when Edward Thorpe wrote his 1962 book on how to win at blackjack, and showed basically if you're a good card counter, you've got better odds of winning than the casino. Now, of course, when you get card counters who go into a casino, the casino do lots of things, including have at least 8 or 10 decks in there, so your memory's got to be superb. But really, they see card counting as cheating. You know, for me, that's skill. But you know what they do is anyone that's caught card counting is classed as a cheater, which to me is just despicable beyond anything I can think of. You know, so but the thing is, even with card counting, you have to do it for a long time, even to get a small, you know, kind of small profit. So Dominic O'Brien, the world memory champion, he went out, spent 8 weeks in Vegas, and he came out after 8 weeks, and I think he'd won with sort of $8,000 to $10,000 over 8 weeks. In terms of making a living, you can't make your living card counting. Poker, of course, much more skillful game. Obviously it's as much about psychology of making your opponents think you've got certain cards or not got certain cards as much as it is about what you've been dealt. So there's loads of psychology in poker, but of course poker is a zero-sum game. There are winners at the expense of losers. There are a very small number of consistent winners, means there's an incredibly large amount of consistent losers. there as well. But of course, anything that's got skill in, people think that if I practice, I play, I can get better, I can make, you know, and we do get, and we had an example here at this university, somebody who left to become a professional poker player. Now, my guess is if everyone who leaves and is successful, there's another 999 that don't have any success at all in terms of making a living out of it. So the psychology of poker, to me, it's just very easy to understand. Here is something, it's a bit like any other skill game. If you practice, you persist, put in the hours, you could potentially make money from it. But the bottom line is that even the people who are made and call themselves professional, they might have to play 14 hours a day just to earn a living. Yet if they got out a job that they could work 7 hours a day, they could probably make just as much by putting in less effort and energy to do that. But really, I mean, that's, you know, I'm a psychologist, I'm very much interested in the psychology of all of this, but it's amazing how many games, even the ones that are truly chance-based, people develop skill orientations. There's a whole load of social psychological research that shows even in things like, so given, you know, let's say you buy a lottery ticket, there's experiments showing that if you've personally bought a lottery ticket, if someone says how much would you sell it for, okay, if you've chosen it yourself, okay, you ask for more money than if somebody was assigned to you. You know, it shows that somehow that you actually actively picking that lottery had some choice in what happened. I mean, it's a skill orientation where there clearly is no skill orientation at all. So we know even in chance events like scratch cards, lotteries, is that some people develop skill orientation. That might be linked to potential problem gambling in some people. But, you know, like slots in this country, I mean, a lot of my work, you know, I didn't realise anything about adaptive logic and the fact we didn't have a random number generator until the mid-2000s. So all of my work, going right back to my first published papers in the late 1980s, were effectively, I was assuming that the slot machines I was talking about were the same as the ones that were in America. So a lot of my conclusions that I made actually were not. So all these players were telling me it was skillful to do this, this and this, and I rubbished them in the papers going, it's just a chance event. They actually knew what they were talking about. You know, and and I had to then go back and basically revalidate everything that I'd done for the first 15 years of my research, because I built it on the wrong premise. And the thing is, even when I go now and I talk in America or Canada, and I talk about, you know, people give these myths about, you know, slot machine players, and I'll go, but they're not myths in the UK, and they say, no, that's rubbish, they're a chance. I'm going, no, they're not, because we don't use a random number generator. You know, the idea of watching a person's, you know, watching a machine fill up with lots of other people's money without them winning anything does mean it's more likely that when you go on that, doesn't guarantee, but you are more likely to get a payout if you've just seen the machine fill up with hundreds of pounds of somebody else's money. And of course in America and Canada they'll say, no, that's not the point. So really, you know, there is a different psychology for every different form of gambling. As I say, roulette is one of those that, you know, people talk about the double up strategy. That double up strategy obviously does work if you have an unlimited amount of money. You know, so I remember a true story. I was in my local casino and 7 reds had come up on roulette in a row, and of course then people were putting loads of money on black. You know, they basically were applying the law of averages in the short term to the playing situation. This is classic gambler's fallacy, is that, you know, what we're talking about here is people that just expect a black to come up, because there's been 7 reds in a row, can't be another red. Of course there was another red, then there was another red. No, it was 11 reds in a row. It's the most I've ever seen that I personally have experienced. And of course, if you've got an unlimited amount of money, you know, just betting on, you know, basically double the amount each time, you will eventually get your money back and more, but you could be literally into hundreds of thousands of pounds before doing that if you were, you know, gambling 11 or 12 times in a row and it was going against you. It's amazing if you start at 1 and double it, how quickly the money goes up. But, you know, with roulette for me, it isn't about winning. You know, for me it's about taking part and maximising my fun while I'm doing it. But occasionally, and again, I had a really good example in Stockholm where we all got given 100 krona, every conference delegate got given 100 krona to play in the casino Cosmopol where we were staying. And, you know, at the end of the night I came out and I had something like 450 krona, so about 40 quid plus. And that was complete bonus. You know, I came out a winner, especially because it wasn't even my money to start with. It was, you know, it's absolutely brilliant. But roulette, you know, completely different psychology. I say some people just play the numbers, some people, you know, some people just play the colours, some people are just all about the number, their lucky number or whatever. But that's a completely different psychology to poker, because obviously there's no skill in roulette whatsoever.
Now, you've mentioned the gambler's fallacy. Could you quickly explain what's meant by this and how it affects players on a psychological level?
Yeah, well, the gambler, right, we in psychology, we talk about heuristics. Okay, now heuristics are these things that are, another word for it is rules of thumb. And what gamblers love doing is, particularly when it comes to something like, you know, simple heads or tails or red or black on a roulette wheel, is they look at past behaviour that's happened on the wheel or whatever, and they try and extrapolate what they think will happen. And basically what they're doing is applying the law of averages, which, I mean, the law of averages are infinite, and they try and apply it to a short-term situation. So for instance, if you're in a coin tossing game and there have been 5 heads in a row, okay, people will probably say, well, the law of averages, a tail has got to come up next, even though there's an independent 50-50 chance of another same side of the coin coming down again. And of course that's, all these things are totally independent of each other. You could theoretically get 30 heads in a row. Okay, it's unlikely, but you can. And of course that's what people do in gambling situations, is that when people will talk about, there's 2 ways that people will go. So if you've seen red come up 7 times on a row in a roulette wheel, some gamblers will say, oh, that's a hot streak for reds, I'm going to put all my money on red, because there's obviously a hot, reds are having a hot streak. Other people will say, the gambler's fallacy, the law of averages, it's got to be a black next go. Now the thing is, both of those put their money on, and if they win, they'll go, see, my logic worked out for me. Okay, or if it doesn't work out, the thing about heuristics is no predictive validity to them. You can't work out before whether they're going to help you or not. You can only use them retrospectively. But really, people just don't realise that most gambling activities are purely chance, and that each event is independent of the last one, and that's why, as I say, you see the gambler's fallacy. Particularly, roulette is the classic one where you see where people use it all the time. If 3 or 4 colours have come up the same, is that they'll usually bet against that colour on the next one.
In recent years, the online casino industry has witnessed a rise in the popularity of live casinos and live games. How do you explain this popularity? Are consumers just more likely to trust a live game over a virtual game?
Yeah, I think it's very simple. Right, I always say that when I play an online slot machine or I play an online roulette wheel, I'm basically playing with imaginary dice. It's just on the pure behest of what that computer program is. If I gamble on the internet, then I gamble on who is on a football match or a race, and something I know that the event hopefully isn't rigged at the end. I feel I've got an equal chance of winning it. The thing about live dealers are, if that roulette wheel is spinning right in front of you live, okay, I'm more likely to, and I play roulette, I'd be more likely to do it than a pre-programmed, let's say, playing with what I feel is playing with imaginary dice. So it really is about enhancing trust between the the gambler and the gambling operator. I think people want to, some people want that kind of feeling of a live experience sitting in their front room. If you've got a situation where you can still see the sights and the sounds, and I mean that's the thing. I love the actual offline gambling experience. I love walking into a casino and feeling the lights, the noises, the sounds. I'm sorry, that with the best will in the world, you can't recreate that in an online situation. But for me, it isn't about winning money, but I think most online gamblers, they're there, if they're playing poker or they're playing on Betfair or whatever, they're wanting to win money. So it's not, I just think playing with live dealers or whatever enhances that experience and makes them think there's less chance of it being rigged.
And just as a quick
Yeah,
add-on,
sure.
you were talking about roulette being a purely chance game. Recently there was a paper published about a pair of mathematicians who claimed to be able to use chaos theory to boost a player's edge to 20%, which for European games is approximately 10 times the house edge. Any credence in?
No idea. I don't know what. I can't comment because I don't know their system. I mean, as far as I'm aware, I mean, obviously people have said that loads of people come up with systems saying that there was one a few years ago where people could basically work out what they claimed. They could work out what quadrant a ball would fall in based on how fast the ball was spinning, where the ball was put in, and of course what you do is put all your chips on what the quadrant you think that's going to fall. Now, obviously, at the end of the day, roulette wheel is something that works on physics. So that's not to say somebody couldn't come up with a mathematical formula, but you'd have to know so many in the time that it takes to do that. I'm not saying that technology isn't there to do it, but to me, it sounds incredibly sophisticated, and my guess is the number of people who would be able to do that would be very small. That's not to say that it's impossible to increase your winnings, but you know, at the end, I'm a psychologist, and most people don't have lots of fancy gizmos to help you do that.
That's the difficulty. They said it's theoretically possible, but you have to cart an array of high-speed cameras into the casino to pull it off.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah. Again, if you've got all the bases covered and you know where the ball first went in and whatever, I'm sure you could mathematically work. I don't think you could do it to the number, but I think the idea of working out per quadrant is probably theoretically possible.